get my recording going so we can save this archive and send it out to folks. So it looks like we got our recording on. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to share my screen, so you guys will just have to let me know if for some reason you're having an issue seeing it. But hopefully that shows up for everybody. Let's see. Let me know in chat. Let's see, we've got some thumbs up, that's good. I'll try and pull up my chat and have it over here in my side window so I can keep an eye on things as we're going. But otherwise, let's see here. We've got my title slide, and I've got just a little after 1, or a little after noon rather. So without further ado, I think we'll get going. So for those of you that don't know me, which through the magic of the internet and the unfortunate nature of COVID, there's many folks who may not have ever met me face to face, or we've never actually talked. My name is James Murphy, and I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resource Agent here at UGA Extension, Rockdale County. This is my normal sort of monthly lunch and learn series where we cover different topics. Most stuff is focusing on home landscaping and horticulture because that's most of my calls that I get here in Rockdale County. But this topic is a new one for me, actually. This is something that I've always been kind of interested in because I am a biologist by training, an entomologist specifically, so somebody who works with insects. But I do like the sciencey side of gardening, and I think when most folks think about hydroponics, it really comes across as this sciencey thing, as something that is beyond the realm of normal gardening. And I think as we get going on this topic today, what we're going to see is that this has a lot in common with our conventional gardening. It's just done through a different lens. And so, yeah, you know, despite all of the beakers and meters and test strips and nutrient chemical solutions, it may seem like a whole different world, but in fact, there's a lot here that is very grounded in the concepts that we are familiar with from the perspective of normal gardening. If anybody's having any issues, I do have the chat box pulled up. I'll try to see if we can have some natural breaks. If we do get questions, we will have time to regroup and have questions certainly at the end. But as you type them in chat, I'll see if I can get to them if we have a break between slides. But otherwise, we're just going to get rocking and rolling, and we're going to see how this goes. Once my keyboard works. There we go. So before we get into the practical aspects of hydroponics, I wanted to cover a bit of the history of hydroponics. And again, this being a new topic for me, I was interested in just kind of seeing where this came from, where this seemingly very modern subject came from. And what I discovered is that throughout the scope of human history, there are actual historical precedents dating back not just hundreds of years, but millennia in human history that indicate early human uses of water culture for gardening plants. Some notable examples of this were in Egypt, hieroglyphics indicating folks using gardens to cultivate plants as well as fish for food. Of course, one of the most famous examples in all human history is perhaps the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, pictured here in illustration. And there's also some evidence to suggest natives in Mesoamerica, so Central South America, utilized some soilless or soil-light gardening techniques in areas that were less than arable or less than friendly to conventional farming. Of course, these aren't the only examples. There's just a few that I've pulled that I thought were interesting. Getting into sort of what would become the foundation for modern hydroponics or the study of soilless agriculture, we can only credit Sir Francis Bacon himself. In 1627, a book, Silva Silvarum, which was published 1 year posthumously, that actually started to discuss this concept. And at that time, it became kind of a hot topic, folks trying to explore whether plants could be grown in water alone. And experiments began, which essentially concluded that plants grew better in less pure water rather than distilled water. So that's when people started to get the inkling that it's not water alone, but there are still some key things that you have to look at, which really was the foundation of hydroponics. From there, we have a gentleman out in California in 1937, Sir William Gerke, not actually a knight, but I was on the Sir Francis Bacon kick there, so I guess that's how that got added. But this gentleman was actually responsible for coining the term hydroponics as a direct corollary or a direct complement to geoponics, which what we would consider as normal sort of in-soil agriculture. And he became famous, you can see pictured here, for his 25-foot tall tomato plants grown in his backyard. Unfortunately, I don't think he got all the recognition that he really deserved. In fact, some folks that kind of swooped in after the fact have some things that are named for them, and Gerke seems a bit lost to history, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. Getting a little bit closer to the modern day, another gentleman, Alan Cooper, created the nutrient film technique, which is one of the techniques that we will cover as we go through some of these actual setups. And so this is I would say really solidifying our true understanding of how to optimize these systems in a way that they can be viable, and moreover, they can be sustainable from the perspective of conserving water and conserving chemicals while still producing excellent quality plants. Looking forward a bit, as of 2023, hydroponic crops are forecasted to be worth around $750 million globally in just a few short years here. And of course, that can be kind of a hard number to really put an exact amount on. I have not seen the study that generated this number, but still that's pretty staggering for something that is otherwise considered fairly niche. But especially where hydroponics shines is growing plants where they might not otherwise be grown. It's interesting to think about that in the context of maybe areas of the developing world or dealing with issues related to something like climate change. So now that we've talked about the history, let's drill down a little bit further into what is hydroponics practically. So hydroponics, generally speaking, is the practice of growing plants without the use of soil. Now we are going to replace soil with some other stuff, but without what we typically think of as soil, which is a combination of organic material, water, air, and mineral components. The actual term hydroponic, who as we mentioned was coined by that gentleman Gerke, comes from the Latin, and it means working water. So hydro being the root or the stem for water, and ponos, the stem for labor. Hydroponic cultivation can range from very simple techniques to very complex. I think that's something even I didn't fully appreciate until I got started doing the research for this talk. But I think a lot of times it's intimidating to folks to think of the idea of doing hydroponic cultivation, when in fact, if you just want to dip your toes in the water, no pun intended, you can get started on hydroponic cultivation at a very low bar, but you can, of course, get very complicated with it if you're so inclined. And finally, the major underlying principle here is to provide everything that the soil normally does. I'm glad you like the pun, Cassie. Everything that the soil normally does in a more controlled manner. So if you've ever gardened in the soil, you know there's a number of factors outside of your control, especially if you're growing conventionally, outside, not in a greenhouse or indoor context. So things like sunlight, humidity, rainfall, all of these things can be very hard to control. But when you're growing hydroponically, and moreover when you're growing correctly, you can control these factors, and your end result or your net result is that plants can grow faster, can grow larger, and can produce more predictable yields. I use the word predictable here, not necessarily larger, because yes, you can do that, but I think the more core principle or something that should be taken home when looking at these systems is to look at predictability, to make a system that even though there's a lot more moving parts, you have control of those parts rather than them being left to chance. The flip side of this is, of course, that if this is done incorrectly, it's not necessarily going to be any better and can, in fact, in some ways be worse than conventional gardening, as we'll get into in a second when we talk more about advantages versus disadvantages. So if you do this wrong, or you're kind of lax about it, or you spend all this money on a big setup and then you don't invest in the time and effort, you can run into the same pitfalls, if not worse, because now you're out all this money and you got all this stuff taking up room in your garage or wherever you've ended up putting it. Something else that I want to touch on before we go any further, there's can sometimes be a bit of a misconception of the term hydroponics versus aquaponics. And there are some other sub-disciplines of hydroponics that kind of get thrown around there too, but this is one I think in particular, especially with sort of the homesteading movement, with folks getting excited about these type of things and being more sustainable or producing their own food. So aquaponics is distinct from hydroponics in really one key way, and that is that aquaponics utilizes many of these same principles, but you're also putting aquaculture, that is the rearing and raising of aquatic organisms, so generally thought of as fish, but in some cases you can do this in saltwater contexts, and I think in Florida and maybe a few other places they've done this with shrimp or even lobster. But this is done to help cycle nutrients, but especially for commercial operations, it can help to augment that revenue stream by having another product to sell. I see somebody's asking if we're getting a recording. Yes, absolutely. I've got this recording right now, so I can send around that archive. It will take a minute to convert, but once it's done converting, I can send that to everybody who pre-registered. And if you don't get it, feel free to email me and I can get you a link. Another note that I want to add talking about aquaponics is that hydroponics can already be kind of complicated, as we'll get a look at as we go through this talk. But adding another system of living organisms, of vertebrates, often in this case, can create additional complexity. You've got more mouths to feed, and it can also lead to issues of stress and disease. So these are yet more cogs in this machine to manage. And if you're already an accomplished aquarist, if you know your fish, maybe this isn't so daunting to you, but I think if you're just getting started, maybe this isn't the route that you want to get started with. However, from my research, if you do this, you probably want to get the fish situated first and then the plants second, because you're going to be using that environment to inform your plant's environment. So you kind of have to have an order of operations there. Let's get into some of the positives and negatives of hydroponics. So starting just with advantages. So first off, hydroponic systems are controlled, semi-closed, or perhaps in some cases, essentially fully closed systems, or as close to fully closed as we can realistically achieve. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that the benefit of this is that nutrients can be precisely measured and therefore managed. And plants are going to get what they need when they need it. We'll talk in depth about nutrients a little bit later, but just drill down on that is one of the biggest difference versus conventional gardening that can be, a lot more art than science in many ways, depending on how you go about it. One of the other things that folks are often interested in is water conservation, or conservation in general. And so whether this is of a personal concern that you want to make less of an impact, and so you want to see how you can conserve water, or if we're looking at in context for agriculture in areas that maybe have reduced access to water, hydroponics can be beneficial for both of these. And studies that I've seen indicate that in some cases, depending on the technique used, you may be able to reduce that water consumption by 10 times compared to conventionally grown field crops. And that depends on numerous factors. I don't know if that's an average or an outlier, but it is out there as a potential reduction factor. Another benefit is crops can be grown essentially anywhere where at least you do have some access to water and the other things that you need. But this opens up the utilization of a bunch of different kinds of spaces, right? So now we can talk about growing indoors. If maybe you've got a small home, or maybe you've got a decent sized home, but you've just got a small lot that you don't feel like you can put up a greenhouse, or you can't really grow somewhere, you could dedicate a room to growing this inside, right? But also you can grow in outdoor spaces that maybe aren't so friendly to farming conventionally. So in a similar way that we usually at Extension will recommend folks go the route of raised beds, if maybe you've got very rocky or compacted soil and it's not super great for growing, hydroponics could be another solution for that. Another benefit is proper practice will yield more consistent results. That's something I stressed a couple slides back, but consistency is key here. And I think for a lot of folks that are into gardening, that's one of the things that they can stress about, at least early on, when you really are worried about your yields and kind of getting perfection and you want this beautiful produce. And so as you get more experienced and you understand what your plants need and how to look at the signs and symptoms of plant issues, this will allow you to achieve more predictable outcomes because you can correct things more directly and you can affect change more directly rather than being reliant on Mother Nature to hopefully want to play nice with you. Another thing that I'll point out is the potential for reduced disease and pest pressure. I'll stress the word potential because it doesn't fully eliminate it, but it can help reduce that stuff down. And the added benefit of this is with a reduced disease and pest pressure, typically that's going to mean a proportional reduction in reliance on things like chemical pesticides, fungicides, what have you. If you're reducing these pressures due to this technique of growing, you may have to reduce reliance on some of these things, and that may help make up in some regards for costs that you're going to have to absorb elsewhere. Speaking of cost, let's get right into the disadvantages. So the first off the bat is, of course, cost. Depending on your type of system, your tools that you're willing to purchase or that you already have, your willingness and ability to do it yourself, and the general scale, these can go from very, very inexpensive, which we'll show, but I think for what most people think of for kind of an active setup, it's basically always going to be, pound per pound of produce created, going to be more expensive, at least out of the gate, compared to typical conventional soil cultivation. I don't want that to dissuade you. Gardening full stop is never a cheap endeavor. If you want to do it right, it's going to cost you some money, but typically if you're trying to compare apples to apples, it's just going to end up costing you a bit more. Another thing to think of, which we'll illustrate in detail a bit later, is just complexity. There's going to be more moving parts, and that's not necessarily, again, that there are maybe more total moving parts. It's just more moving parts that you're responsible for now as a gardener. So that means that any single point of failure, if you've got an issue with a pump, an issue with your water chemistry, an issue with your reservoir, with your substrate, anything like that, could be that linchpin that could cause everything to kind of fall apart if you're not careful. And for folks, if you're not super tech savvy, or it's been a while since you took organic chemistry, or maybe you never took it at all, some of this stuff might be kind of daunting as you start to reorient yourself with what some of this stuff means. But hopefully after this talk, you'll be a little more at ease, and there are good resources out there if what I say isn't enough to cover it for you, which I imagine it won't be. This is just an hour-long talk. So I just talked about diseases on the last slide. So we talked about how they're not eliminated. It's good if you select for plant varieties that are resistant to some of these diseases, to some of our fungal bacterial diseases that can get introduced into these some systems. The real problem with hydroponic systems and diseases is that because everything is sharing that same communal media, that same nutrient solution, if disease gets introduced, it can really spread like wildfire as compared to how it might be isolated to a couple plants in a row or something like that, and easier to take care of in a soil context. The last thing I want to talk about is algae management. So this kind of goes hand in hand with disease management, even though it's not strictly a disease. It's more of a gear or a setup wear and tear or troubleshooting type issue. So if you're not properly monitoring your reservoirs if you don't buy good ones to begin with, or you don't set them up correctly, you can end up with algae buildup that can cause all kinds of issues with shuttling water around your setup, moving it through plumbing and tubing, or clog up pumps full stop and end up necessitating a total tear down refurb, as well as competing with your plants for nutrients and really throwing off the balance of everything. So algae are a big no-no and are to be avoided as much as possible. So one of the big questions, especially because this is a homeowner talk, is to do it yourself or not. And I have to say that I'm kind of split on this. I don't have a true yes or no answer for this because I think there's a lot of factors at play for the individual person. On the left here, you'll have a couple screenshots I took, one from a YouTube thumbnail, another one from somebody's Pinterest collection of DIY hydroponic ideas. And those are really just to illustrate that there's a ton of great resources out there. I can't necessarily vouch for any single one of them, or certainly not all of them, but that is to say that if you are inclined to do it yourself and you're handy and you've got tools and maybe you've already got a little bit of gardening know-how, then I think it's a good way to cut down on costs to think about doing some DIY aspects, even if it's not totally DIY, even if you're not, going back to, trying to make your own aqueducts to run your own water from a local stream, so everything is done yourself in this kind of setup. There's a lot of kind of hacks and kind of halfway things that you can kind of get around some of this stuff. However, if what you're looking for as a home gardener is to really elevate your practice, or to get things that are kind of ready to go out of the box, you're having to do sort of less fudging or guesswork, there's also just as much, if not more, support now for home hydroponics to get you ready to go, to give you kind of everything you need out of the box. And those are a couple screenshots right there I found from a couple websites that, again, if you want a solution out of the box, they're ready to go. However, of course, like we talked about, that's where some of your cost is going to come in. You got to be willing to swallow that as a potential downside. But if you've got the budget for it and you want something that is just going to be maybe more ready to go, I'd suggest getting started maybe with something small, starting with a single plant, and then once you get the feel for what hydroponic gardening is like, maybe then you can make the leap into doing your own DIY setup when you kind of understand the fundamentals. So where do you begin? Now that we've kind of covered, seems like a lot of ground already, maybe your head's kind of spinning. Where do you start? So very first, I think it would be good to decide on what your system looks like. What type of hydroponic system do you envision? And this is oftentimes going to be limited by the space that you have available. If all you've got is a windowsill, then you probably only have one method available to you. However, if you've got a shed or a greenhouse or a garage or a decently sized deck or backyard, really things start to open up. So I think you have to answer that question for yourself first to then inform where you go from there. And where you go from there is, of course, deciding then what you would like to grow. I think, again, this is going to be impacted by some of the inherent limitations of hydroponics as far as what plants play nice with a hydroponics system versus those that are a little bit more finicky. And also already your familiarity with gardening and your understanding of how to get things going. But we'll talk about plant selection in a bit, so I won't get too far into it. After that, once you've decided on your system and what you want to grow, go ahead and purchase and assemble that system, get it going. Before you add any nutrients, if you're doing an active system with pumps and stuff, I would go ahead and familiarize yourself with how those pumps work, run it through, with some water just to see how everything works before you get a single plant in there. Figure out how that water works and how you're going to manage it. From there, you can either purchase already started seedlings, or you can get them started yourself if you're already familiar with seed starting. But either way, you can go from seed, but I think it's better in these contexts to have something that's already started. Maybe once it already has its first 2 or 3 sets of true leaves and is kind of well established, that's a good time to think about transplanting. After that, you're going to mix up and monitor your nutrient media. I told you we'd talk about nutrients, and we certainly will, so I won't touch on that too much. And then you're going to plant. And finally, you're going to scoot on back to step 5, that mixing and monitoring and adding water and troubleshooting, and basically go back there until it's time to harvest, and you can kind of have an after action report and say, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? And think about the next time you start all over. So for plant selection, this is, again, just a general rule of thumb, and it is my understanding that you could probably, if you really put your, a ton of money and effort to it, you could probably grow just about anything hydroponically or aeroponically, but it gets considerably more complicated as you get into certain realms of different plants. So for folks getting started out, usually what I recommend are things over here in this novice column. So you'll see these are all things that are going to be leafy. They're not going to be super dependent on other limiting nutrients. It's mostly just going to be kind of nitrogen is the biggest thing important to put out, nice, good leafy growth. But this does also encompass herbs. So not just leafy greens like lettuce, kale, and spinach, but you can, really you can get a lot of decent variety out of that in terms of flavors and end uses from thinking about herbs as a beginner hydroponic project. As you step up, you would move away from things that are just purely leafy vegetables into those that are fruiting vegetables. So we have things like our tomatoes, we have true fruits like strawberries, but also peppers, and even cucumbers, which add an additional layer of complexity in that you're probably going to need some type of trellising system to go atop your hydroponic system, because they are cucurbits, they like to run on vines, and so you're probably going to have to be adjusting that on top of all of your other stuff. Similar things can be said for things like tomatoes that are probably going to need some caging. Cassie just asked about root plants in the expert category, and yes, that's what I was just about to get to. So once we get to things that are root veggies, if you think about this process, they generally don't play as nice, or they're very nutrient intensive in order to get good root development in a hydroponic context. And so especially something like a radish, which usually grows so easily, you can grow them basically anywhere, even in our native soils, they do pretty well, versus all the time and effort to try and get them going. It's hard to say, and that I'm not telling anybody to not do it. I'm just saying, there's certain plants that they're just going to be easier to realize in a conventional context. And some of these, we just mentioned cucumbers as a nice potential intermediate option, and so you may see watermelons and say, well, that's a cucurbit too, but watermelons are huge and they take up a ton of space. And so if you're willing to devote an entire massive space to hydroponically grown watermelons, again, I'm not going to tell you don't do it. I'm just saying it's going to be much harder than some of these other potential projects. So let's get into our basic hydroponic system types. We have passive versus active. So our passive systems are going to use minimal or no electricity to aerate and move that water. They're going to instead use the power of capillary action to deliver the water to our root system, and they can be nearly set it and forget it. I don't encourage anybody to neglect their garden ever, but these get closer to that, you have less worry about them or about having to constantly monitor them. These are often going to be cheaper to purchase and maintain. They offer a lower barrier of entry. However, they may not produce as dramatic results as some of our active systems. Kratky, I'm glad you mentioned that one. Without spoiling too much, it is, and we will talk about it in depth. Getting into our active systems, so this is going to utilize some combination of air and water pumps to move water against the flow of gravity and add oxygen into our system. Oxygen is super important for our plants, and I think it's often forgotten, but by using some technology, we can help add that into the system. This may require timers, valves, plumbing, etc. for effective assembly. And so this isn't always the case, and you may devise a system that steps around this. But again, when we talk about complexity and cost, things you're having to have up front, just something to consider in an active setup. This does also generally necessitate more active monitoring and management. Now, we do have tech that makes that easier, but that tech is not free, and oftentimes it does get quite expensive, and it depends on how far you want to go with it. You know, we have small computer modules that can send all these data to your computer, you know, up to the minute effectively, or, you know, up to the day, and you can monitor all this stuff remotely, but it does still need active management, stay on top of it. These are, of course, going to have a higher barrier of entry compared to our passive systems, but these are the ones that generally are going to produce those more predictable yields and maybe the more sort of dramatic hydroponic effect that we typically think of. So now let's get into some of our basic components for really, you know, any hypothetical hydroponic setup. So usually when I talk about gardening, I talk about soil is where we start, but since we don't have any soil, we are looking at the water first and foremost. And this is something that I think, you know, we get a lot of questions about what kind of water should I use for hydroponics. So the first one, if you live in a rural area, maybe well water, if you're on a well, I would just absolutely recommend that you do some testing on your well before you decide to use it for numerous reasons. One is just to assess where it's at from a nutrient standpoint for what it offers to your crops, but also maybe to check out if you've got any issues with bacteria. We do regularly test bacteria in well water here at the Extension office, so if that's something you're interested in, we can certainly help out with that. But you don't want to be putting bacteria on plants that you're intending to eat. So that is something at least you want to know going in. With well water too, of course, you may require some filtration or conditioning to alter pH or remove things if you've got issues with sedimentation, or, you know, maybe you've got nutrient levels that are kind of out of whack with your goals, and so you may have to do some additional remediation there. Tap water or municipal water, of course, the biggest benefit is that it is available. However, you have to mitigate the chlorination. And so you can do this a couple of different methods. The most common, I think, would be to just pour up what you need and let it sit for at least 24 hours to allow that chlorine to volatilize. But, you know, there are tablet remediations available. Either way, you know, if this is your only source and this is what you want to go with, it is possible. Just know that I wouldn't recommend just putting straight tap water immediately into your hydroponic setup. Finally, we have distilled or reverse osmosis, RO water. This stuff is inherently neutral because it's had basically everything else removed from it to get just down to the pure H2O or very close to pure H2O. However, it is, of course, costly. It's yet another cost to potentially add to your system. And you have to either regularly purchase it, you know, order it in, something like that, or construct a separate system like a steam evaporator, steam distillate column. Emily asked if tap water should sit uncovered for 24 hours to evaporate chlorine. Yes, I would recommend at least 24 hours for tap water. Now that we've talked about our water from a dehumidifier, you know, I haven't run into that. That is not a question that I can answer off the top of my head. You may be able to get away with that because I imagine that would be sort of a reverse osmosis type deal, but I don't know. That would be a question that I would have to do some research on before I could confidently answer it. That's not a bad thought. So for nutrient concerns, now that we've talked about sort of our base for all of this, our liquid media, what do we have to add to it? So plants require a suite of 17 total nutrients for proper growth. These nutrients are going to be broken down into two major categories. We have our atmospheric, so those that are just available in the environment essentially at all times, barring an extreme environment. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, so comes from the air and also from the water itself. And then there's going to be our mineral nutrients. So this is going to be basically everything else. These are further going to be broken down into the categories of macronutrients, secondary nutrients, and micronutrients. And so you can see these listed over here. This is a figure from Florida Extension that talked about how we think about the nutrients for hydroponics. And you can see we've got, they're arranged kind of like a food pyramid. So we've got our major macronutrients at the bottom, our nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, our secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then up at the top, we've got a number of different things: molybdenum, chlorine, copper, boron, iron, manganese, zinc, among several other things that could kind of be up there in trace amounts. Titanium even, I think, is classified as a micronutrient. Usually we would estimate these requirements for plants for conventional crops using soil testing, but another benefit of hydroponics is that they can be precisely dialed in based on your individual water chemistry. If you really want to get fancy with it, you could dial these in perfectly to exactly what you want. However, as I mentioned earlier, plants are still susceptible to deficiencies and burn, if there's too much nutrients in there, if this is mismanaged. So one of the things that I want to talk about this, we mentioned Mr. Kratky earlier, which, he's getting started in the 30s, and he was approaching at kind of quantifying this. This is what kind of came out of his work back in the 30s. Another gentleman by the name of Hoagland put together this sort of standardized solution, and this is still cited today as, kind of the golden standard for a basic hydroponic nutrient solution. So without bogging you down too much, just understand that we have basically our full complement of macronutrients and micronutrients. And you can see here, this figure even indicates how many grams of compound versus how many milliliters to actually put this together in the proper ratio. So again, that's just kind of driving home. You can see those various ratios of kind of our macro stuff versus our micro stuff to see what you actually need for plants. So how do you actually manage this stuff? Your plants need it, but how do you actually do it? So it's much the same way that you would do it for conventional gardening. You use fertilizer, in this case, liquid nutrients or solid nutrients, depending on the route you want to go, which we'll touch on that real quick. So in the kind of the question of liquids versus solids, liquids are going to be premixed, and they're generally going to be applied at label rates. They will tell you exactly how much. They're going to be a concentrate that you can then dilute and you can use for your plant food. Solid fertilizers or solid nutrients can allow for flexibility, and you can custom tailor them for individual plants. If you've got a lot of different things going on, or things that maybe require a bit more, or in different phases of growth, they need maybe a little more phosphorus and less nitrogen, or vice versa, you can tailor that more exactly. However, they can be a bit more tricky to get into solution. Something like calcium carbonate can be difficult to get into solution. It has to be, a particular temperature. It's a very fine powder. It likes to precipitate. So they're not necessarily as intuitive, which is why for a lot of folks, I just say, go with the liquid nutrients, right? Something else to think about is that nutrient volume has to be balanced over time because plants are obviously going to drink water while in these setups. And so they're going to drink more water than they do drink nutrients. And so over time, that remaining water is going to get more and more concentrated. And so you're going to have to continue to dilute that either with pure water or maybe half strength or quarter strength nutrient solutions. And then eventually change that water entirely, because it will get fully concentrated. So usually around every 3 to 4 weeks, or maybe more often. Your nutrient solution should be kept around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is typically in that realm of what you would think of as good soil temperatures for a lot of our plants to germinate and grow anyway. But this also helps to keep things in solution so they don't denature, and also so you don't have any issues with additional stress, or the hotter this stuff gets, the more plants are going to want to drink, the more they're going to respire and transpire. So we want to keep things at a good temperature range so we don't stress our plants and end up having this cascading issue of too much water being drank, and then an over concentration of nutrients, and then on and on. Overall recommendation, as I said, liquid nutrients over solid nutrients, unless, again, you're already kind of well versed in gardening and maybe you already custom mix your own fertilizer. If you are, then maybe that's for you. However, for folks just getting started, the liquid stuff is, I think, a good way to go. Another note I'll say is don't use standard liquid fertilizer. So the stuff that's, I've pictured here, I don't mean to just pick on Miracle-Gro, but, any of these other liquid fertilizers meant for soil gardening, I don't really like them particularly because they can be harder to measure and figure out how much you're adding regardless. But this stuff is typically not concentrated enough for you to deliver the nutrients that you need in a hydroponic context. So let's talk a little bit more about managing your water. And so now we're stepping away from the purely nutrient concerns, and we're talking about some of the chemistry of our water. So I apologize if this is a little bit over anybody's head, but if you want to look more into this, there's plenty of resources online, and we're happy to try and answer those questions if you have them. So one thing I will say first is that unlike conventional gardening, these parameters should be monitored daily. We certainly don't ask, I like folks to be out in their garden all their time just to keep track of things if things are getting a little weird out there, so you know what's going on. But if you're doing hydroponic gardening, you really have to stay on top of this stuff, especially if you're using some type of active setup. The first big parameter that you need to pay attention to that does go hand in hand with our nutrients is pH. And so this would be our acidity and our alkalinity. So this is the amount of hydroxide or hydrogen ions that are dissolved in our water. And so this is going to be the most important metric to set and monitor because it is going to determine the availability of all those other nutrients to the plant roots. If you step outside of this range, you could be at the perfect concentration, but it's just not going to be available due to that chemical imbalance. It is a physical imbalance that does not allow these nutrients to pass into the plant membranes. The typical desired range is around 5.5 to 6.5, usually a little closer to 6.5. But this is something that can be modified, but it's again why we encourage you to test your water or know where you're sitting, because you can use something like these bottles I've got shown here, typically referred to as pH up or pH down, so a base and an acid, an alkaline substance, an acidic substance that can help to modify that. Another thing to pay attention to is electrical conductivity, or EC. This is the result of dissolved electrolytes measured in millisiemens per centimeter. This meter that I actually have right here, up here in kind of the top left image, this will measure both pH and EC. And so this is something I would recommend if you are serious about hydroponics, you consider purchasing. They usually come with instructions and we can get you figured out for a desired range on EC. But this is going to tell you basically how much of your nutrients are actually dissolved in solution and give you a better idea on how to manage it so you're not just having to do guesswork. The last one that folks usually look at a fair amount is TDS, or total dissolved solids. And this will be the combined content of all inorganic and organic substances. So again, you can get a meter to measure this, but that's a good way to do it if you're trying to get a better picture of what's going on. Getting more into some of our basic components, we have our reservoir. So this is actually what's going to hold our nutrient media. So for starters, this should provide ample space for nutrient solution. With having something with ample space, it's going to be easier to maintain, and it's going to help, again, to regulate that temperature and pH. A greater volume is going to be harder to get into a situation where you have drastic swings one way or another. So if possible, I recommend leaning towards a larger reservoir than you might initially think you need. It may be better to have a bit more than a bit less, unless you're absolutely space constrained. The outside should be as opaque as possible to reduce algae buildup. We mentioned algae as kind of a bugbear for these setups earlier. I know I've got pictured a mason jar there, which that is a potential option we'll touch on a little bit later. But generally, otherwise, something that like a black bucket, this other container I've got pictured here is sort of a commercially available option. You'll see too that that has a lid that's going to help with evaporation and again help with algae issues. Whatever material chosen should be inert, so something that is not going to leach into water, something that's not going to degrade. If you're particularly concerned about things, I know there's a lot of concern with reusable water bottles and things like BPA and stuff like that. Just knowing what kind of compound you've got, because of course this stuff may leach into your water and therefore get taken up into your plants. Just having an idea of what it's made out of, especially if you're upcycling something rather than buying something purpose-made. I would recommend, if it's not purpose-made, marking the inside with some kind of volume indicator to show the total volume of what you're working with, especially when you've got it fully filled, so you know how much to dilute it back up to when you're doing nutrient dosing, or maybe you're doing a bit of refilling. And typically, this is a rule of thumb, think about around 4.5 to 5 gallons per square foot of growing space. So that's how much water typically you're going to need. Now moving into growing media, this is going to be any of a number of different substances, but just like our container, it should be inert in that it's not a nutrient substance. This is not something providing nutrients. It's purely structural, and it's going to allow for good drainage and furthermore provide support for our roots. The plants are often going to be supported in a net pot with media contained in a tray. So you can see the net pot up there in the top right. And then we also have right next to it this tray, and you can see all those little raised spots with slots in between that are going to help with drainage, to move water away from the roots when we don't need it there. But that net pot is nice for holding everything together, for allowing those roots to establish, get lots of nice air pockets in there, because that's another essential part of our usual soil composition. And they can usually be had cheaply, and they're versatile, as we'll talk about in a second. If you're interested in doing seed starting, there's a couple things commercially available that I would recommend. So rock wool is made from spun glass and stone. These will come in little columns or cubes that you can place a seed in, and they can be nice and highly absorptive, but also drain quite well. And the same is true for what are called oasis cubes that are actually made from a foam. And these can be great for just getting your individual seeds started, getting your seedlings going. Once you're ready to actually grow, I would recommend using something, either one or a mix of some of the things here. And of course, there are other potential options, things like sand or gravel I've certainly heard of. But grow stones or hydroton, those are the ones you can see up there in that little basket, the little clay spheres. They're extruded clay spheres. They kind of expand like popcorn, and they're great because they're light. They allow a lot of room for plant roots to get established. But then we have some more natural materials as well. So things like cocoa coir, which is just the outside husk of coconuts that's been shredded. It does hold quite a bit more water, so you do have to be aware of that. But it's good because it's nice and light and airy too. Also a mixture of perlite and vermiculite. So these are again kind of inert mineral substances. Perlite does float, be aware of that depending on how you're using it. But these can be good, especially mixed in maybe like a 50-50 ratio. Getting more into some of our basic components, we'll talk about our air pumps and the air stones. We recommend for this a minimum of 500 to 600 cubic centimeters per minute. And so that's around 8 to 9.5 gallons per hour. But I want to say that if you're getting anything on the market that is made for gardening, not for aquariums, you're probably well above this number. So as long as you're getting any basic pump meant for hydroponics, you probably don't have to pay too much attention to that number. Some growers prefer to match the actual wattage to the gallon size of their reservoir. I can't speak to that, but it's just something that I came across when I was doing some research for this, so it may be something for you to think of. Multiple air outlets, which you can see the ones that I've pictured here, have the one up front has 2 and the one in the back has 4. It'll help so you don't have to engineer splits and again other potential points of failure into your setup. If you have dedicated air ports where you can run tubes from, you're not going to have to put in little Y junctions and things like that to split off your airflow. Remember, these are going to put off a constant noise. If you've got a high threshold for noise, maybe this doesn't bother you. But one of the things that I saw is that you generally want to see if you can get ones that are rated for maybe under 45 decibels. This might be something that is trial and error. You know, you may buy one and it ends up being too loud for you and you can hear it through the wall because it's on 24 hours a day and it bothers you, or maybe, you know, it's a little nice white noise and it helps you go to sleep at night. Either way, just something to keep in mind, and of course that goes with energy consumption as well. For actually running between your pump and your stones, you can just use aquarium tubing, but just like our reservoir, we do recommend a dark colored tubing to avoid that algae buildup, to avoid light getting in there, because that's just going to allow things to proliferate. We also recommend using stones that produce smaller bubbles because that's going to be a greater surface area. You're going to have more area for that oxygen to disperse, and therefore that's going to lead to an increased dissolved oxygen in your system, which is going to make it easier and more beneficial for your plants. So another question that is often asked with our hydroponic setups is that of some of our active components, so pumps. These are, as I said, only needed for certain setups, only really needed for our active setups, and they're usually sold as submersible, which these are probably the most common for our beginner hydroponics gardener, or inline. So you can think of ones that are going to actually sit within your reservoir and then pump water up into your grow tray, or however you've got it set up, or one that will actually sit external. This is important for a couple reasons, because just like with our air pumps, we do need to pay attention to the flow rate here. So you want to pay attention to that gallons per hour rate. A good rule of thumb is for what gallons per hour you're shooting for should be roughly your grow area times 1.25. So whatever you're growing plus 25%, and then multiply that by 10. So that'll get you kind of roughly in the area of what you need to look for gallons per hour. And you can divide that by 60 to get gallons per minute if you're doing something maybe a little more complicated like a drip setup and you're trying to figure that out of how much water you're actually going to be delivering. For these setups, especially if you're doing like an ebb and flow, you should think about moving the full volume maybe once every 2 hours in total. So again, you don't necessarily have to do your full volume in one single hour. You don't have to peg that gallon per hour to your setup volume, but maybe think about it every 2 hours. Something else to consider, we have to think again, we're talking complexity, is just the physics of moving water. Water is very heavy, it's energy intensive to move it. So you have to think of a term, what we refer to as head height. And this is crucial for overall pump efficiency, and usually this is a sort of not quite negatively linear relationship, but fairly close to it. But basically what this means is that the calculated efficiency is going to change at various heights above the water line. So put simply, the higher you are trying to deliver water above that pump, the less flow rate you're going to effectively get. So your gallons per hour will drop off. And usually that's going to be available either from your pump manufacturer, or it may even be listed on your box, especially if it's something that is specifically made for hydroponics. Furthermore, when we're talking about head height, this does not account for efficiency drop from drip tubing, because of course that both adds distance, but it also adds a drop in diameter. So that's something else to consider if you're looking at doing a drip system, that can add more complication. I would also, as a quick note, say pay attention to filtration or the lack thereof, especially for our submersed pumps. I've seen online some guides for putting in some DIY filtration, but it's just something to monitor, because you're not running just pure clean water through there. You're going to have issues with salt and other material buildup. So just something to pay attention to over time. This definitely can be a point of failure, and if it's not working at optimal efficiency, it can really affect your grow. So another common question about components is lighting, and there's a number of different categories here, and this could probably be its own talk itself, so I won't spend too much time on it. The first big one is, of course, the sun, which is not controllable, or I'll say less controllable, because maybe you can still pick the site where you want to plant, but it is free. But with free, you do get what you pay for, so sometimes the sun doesn't like coming out, or may not come out, or may come out too much. So you do have to be aware of that. If that's where you're trying to cut costs in your hydroponic setup, you can use the sun, but you lose that element of control, which again is kind of the kernel of this whole practice. Compact fluorescents are something that are often asked about because they are cheap. You don't need a ballast. However, they have a very low output compared to some of our other grow options. So you can consider it almost analogous to our conventional liquid fertilizer that we mentioned earlier. It's just not up to the task. You might be able to make it work in the case of getting some seeds started, because they don't put out a ton of heat, and that may be suitable from a very near distance, but they're just not suitable for really putting out the light that vegetative plants need. Moving into our next couple, we have our metal halides and our high pressure sodium. So these are our typical incandescent grow lights. These do require a ballast, so this is an outboard power conditioning device that is going to actually help to regulate current. These typically also will use a fair amount of power, and they will put off a fair amount of heat. Again, what we're trying to do is replicate sunlight, so I guess it makes a lot of sense that these are going to be in that realm. But one thing I will point out is that our metal halides are going to be in more of a blue-white spectrum, so that should be for vegetative growth or things that maybe are for our leafy vegetables. And then our high-pressure sodium are going to be more in that orange-red, which will be more for our flowering and fruiting. Thanks, Kiana. Sorry you couldn't stick with us. I hope your meeting goes well, and I'll send you the archive. The final one that I want to mention is our light emitting diodes. So LEDs, these are all the rage right now. I think everybody's heard of LED, at least in some form or fashion. These are great in that they are adjustable spectrum, so you can get the benefits of both those metal halide and our high pressure sodium. They are much more energy efficient, and they put off less heat than either of those. However, of course, no such thing as a free lunch. They are more expensive. So I recommend them if you've got the budget for them, but if you don't, maybe you go with some of these other options if you're just getting started. So now, before we wrap up, we're just going to touch on a few of our example systems. So somebody mentioned Kratky earlier, and this is one, I just like saying it, if I'm honest. I like that name, Kratky. It just sort of rolls off the tongue nicely. But this is perhaps our simplest overall setup. If you've ever bought cut flowers from a florist or from the grocery store, and you put them in a vase, and you put in the little packet that comes along with them, you're effectively doing a slight variation of the Kratky method. Basically, you can do this in anything from a mason jar to a large bucket. And I think personally, we talked about earlier, this is a good introduction point, especially if you're trying to maybe get some kids into this, maybe a youth group, or maybe, if you're an educator and you're trying to demonstrate something, over distance learning, giving your kids a project they can do at home to try and do some hydroponic learning. The added benefit is no pumps or plumbing are needed for this. However, you may run into issues with salt concentration later in growth if you're not careful about balancing that nutrient level and checking on your water. So that's why you should check that water level and monitor it recently. So we had somebody comment, said that's how they started their transplants, and said it's awesome. I'm glad to hear the feedback. I think this is something that I would love to try at home too, because I think this is a great way to do some seed starting for folks. It's a bit more unconventional. Or at least certainly was a method I hadn't really encountered. So as you can see, it's illustrated here. You can use anything from like a mason jar, or typically I've seen it too as something like a 5-gallon bucket with opaque sides, and then essentially you're just going to pour up your nutrient media, and you will divide it by the individual volume. Say you make something like if a 5-gallon bucket, you may be able to peg it right at that amount, but for these mason jars, maybe you just pour it up for however many you have and divide by that amount, and then you're going to put your starts in there, and you're going to basically let them go, and then just monitor that water, touch it up with some fresh water as it goes, and just allow that water to kind of passively wick up there and the roots to develop. And it's a very kind of simple way to go about it. And this was developed by Bernard Kratky at the University of Hawaii, which, with small space and not, even though they have some great farmland there, it's getting harder and harder to come by. So maybe they're looking at other methods to do some farming. We had somebody comment says, need to cut the net pods open a bit more for the removal of the transplants. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So they may not be reusable at that point. And pool noodles, yeah, that's something else that I saw. I think they were in that thumbnail of that YouTube video that I put up. That's another hot one that you'll see it all over Pinterest and YouTube and things like that. So getting into something that is not maybe truly passive, but kind of semi-passive, we have a wicking system. So in this case, you're going to have a growing tray either adjacent to or suspended above your reservoir. And this is going to use wicks of any kind of material that you have available or that you'd like to try to move that water using capillary action up into that growth media. And so you can have these sitting, in a tray of that inert material. You can have them either in pots or not in pots, depending on how you want to have them set up. The one thing that makes this kind of semi-passive is I would recommend using some type of aeration in this case, just to keep that dissolved oxygen high, because there's a good chance you can get stagnation. But otherwise, this is kind of the next step up in complexity. You are just passively delivering that water. You're not having to deal with pumps and flow rates and head height and all these different things. But this can be a potential good option for folks wanting to take the next step up. The next one that we think of, this is also kind of analogous to the Kratky method. This is, maybe a higher volume or higher throughput version of the Kratky method, which is deep water culture. I had an uncle that had an aquaponics setup, and he grew his plants like this. But this is where you suspend the plants on a floating raft or platform. Platform should be thick enough so that plant roots are never fully submerged. Plants don't need to be completely underwater. They need oxygen just like you or I. So unless that water is very heavily oxygenated, you would still want to allow some breathing room up there, some headroom. This, unlike our previous plants or our previous system that we looked at, that wicking system can be used for larger, more deep-rooted plants. And you can use, again, some aeration here to help keep that DO2 up. Now we're getting into some of our active systems. So this is one that is very popular, known as the ebb and flow or the flood and drain system. And this is where we're finally getting a water pump into the system. So you're going to suspend these plants from the top of an enclosed growing tray, or they will be set down into the growing tray, maybe on some raised areas. And then you'll utilize a pump to move your nutrient system from the base reservoir. So you can again use a submerged pump to move that up into the root zone before it drains back down. However, now you're getting, because you're in an active system, you have to pay much more attention for how long it takes to fill that root zone, how long it's going to take to go before it needs to dry down. Luckily, a lot of these kits will, they'll come supplied with a pump and a drain kind of ready to go. And furthermore, you integrate this with a timer, right? Because this needs to allow for periods of flooding, of getting plenty of oxygen, or rather plenty of water and nutrients to the root zone, and that flowing, that draining, in order to take that away, allow things to dry down and deliver fresh oxygen to the roots themselves as well. In this case, the trade-off here is that you can eliminate the need of having the air pump there, because if you're doing this correctly, merely the physical action of the rising and lowering of the water will be enough to draw air through the plant roots. But again, it has to be done right, and you have to make sure that everything's draining away, because if it sits in puddles, unfortunately, you can get issues with root rots and all kinds of things like that. The next active system we'll look at is our drip fertigation setup, or a drip setup. So this is similar, if not nearly identical in concept, to what we would think of for many of our in-ground drip irrigation systems, except of course we're no longer using soil, we are using our inert media. This is going to require the use of a pump and a timer to affect this. And of course, you want to prioritize using media that's going to allow for sufficient drainage to allow roots to breathe. So again, when we talked about that, making sure that you have a good maybe mix of kind of more inert mineral components, some extruded clay, along with maybe some coir, or doing a mix of perlite and vermiculite, just making sure that that water is going to be able to come through and is not going to get caught up and bound up and drown our plants. These can be sorry, my Qualtrics session expired. I'm just starting that back up. These can be either used to reclaim your water, so they can come back down into the reservoir, or they can be non-reclamative. And so in that way, you just kind of let them go. The plants will absorb what they need, and then you'll do a drip again when you need it. As we touched on earlier, this is going to, of course, add some cost and complexity and additional points of failure, but it does allow for very targeted application of water and nutrients. The last one that we're going to look at here, this is our nutrient film technique. So again, this was developed back in the 60s. And so this kind of is going to combine the best of both worlds of our drip and ebb and flow system. So by doing this, what you'll end up with is a suspension on an angled tray to allow gravity to effectively move a thin nutrient film that is delivered by a drip apparatus before returning it back to the reservoir. So that has first the benefit of allowing things to be kind of terraced or tessellated upwards to allow for a more vertical format, or maybe to maximize more your surface area. But this system is thought to be among the best, if done correctly, for conserving water and supplying O2, just because it's going to reduce the amount of water needed, because you're really only contacting just the root tips, just the very ends. So you get plenty of oxygen, you have fewer concerns with root rot, and all of the nutrients delivered. This is much more complicated, I think, for your starting gardener. But if you really get into it, especially for some of our commercial operations, they start to look a bit more like this. So with that, we come to the end. I know I didn't cover everything under the sun, but I hope you guys got some good information out of it. But I know this was, it's only just an hour, and we even had some folks that had to take off a little bit early. So I'll hopefully be able to send this to everybody. And even if you didn't get it, get all of it today, you can get some more of it later. But for now, I've got my contact information up here on the screen in case you want to take that down and you want to get in touch with me. Another thing that I want to say is that we have a survey. If you guys would fill this out, I would be very, very grateful. This will help us with our demographics info, as well as allow me more info for doing programming in the future. So I just tossed that in chat. If y'all would fill that out for me, I would very much appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll open it up to questions, and you guys can let me know if you have anything. And if you don't, that's fine too. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll see if anybody has anything. If y'all don't have any, excellent, Susan, and thank you for tuning in from all the way over in the UK. That is absolutely incredible. I'm so grateful to get an international audience. That really means a lot to me.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I came late, and
Oh, no worries.
because but I need to start from the beginning, and next time I'll hopefully get on and start from the beginning.
Yeah, sure
But
thing. Well,
it's good to hear some of the things to consider. But thank you for your time.
yeah, of course. Happy to do it. And like I said, I'll send out the archive. And if my information is right up there, I can probably take it and just drop it in chat if you want. I'll put my email address here for anybody who wants it. And if you think of anything, you can always shoot me an email.
I'm so beginning that I don't know how to ask a question yet. But
Okay.
you have given me, a little place to start. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right, everybody. Will there be a copy of the class? Yes, absolutely. I will be sending that out to folks. Um, Again, I really just want to express my deep appreciation for everybody joining us today. Um, it really stinks that we can't do programs like this in person, but I feel so grateful to be able to expand my audience and to, sort of meet new people in a new and interesting way. So I want to thank you guys again so much for that. I will put the survey link one more time in chat here. If you guys would fill that out for me, as I said, it helps with my reporting, so I can prove to the state and federal government that I'm meeting the requirements, that I'm reaching out to all the people that I need to reach out to, but it helps to inform my programming for the future as well. So if y'all could do that, I would sincerely appreciate it. Other than that, I think I'm going to go ahead and see if I can stop my recording.